This week on Inside Olympia, how are President Trump's environmental policies and rollbacks affecting Washington State's green priorities? What is the status of Washington's Cap and Invest program? And is Washington's transition to a clean energy future on track? On the program, for the full hour, Department of Ecology Director Casey Sixkiller.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. The Trump administration and the state of Washington are working at cross purposes when it comes to environmental and climate policy. What does that mean for former Governor Jay Inslee's climate legacy and the state's Cap and Invest program? What are the implications for Washington's transition to a clean energy future, including a mandate to phase out carbon-based energy and gas-powered cars? On the program for the full hour this week to discuss these issues and much more is the state's relatively new Director of the Department of Ecology, Casey Sixkiller. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Congratulations on this role. Before we launch in, let me just give a little bit of background on your bio for those who don't know you. The Director of the Department of Ecology, Casey Sixkiller, was appointed to this position by Governor Bob Ferguson back in January. Prior to that, he served as the Regional Administrator for the Federal Environmental Protection Agency under then-President Joe Biden. Sixkiller has also served as Deputy Mayor of Seattle and Chief Operating Officer of King County. He's worked for two members of Washington's congressional delegation, including Senator Patty Murray, and he helped establish the Washington, D.C. office for the Cherokee Nation. Sixkiller is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, a graduate of Dartmouth College, and if his last name sounds familiar, the son of UW Husky football legend Sonny Sixkiller. Also, a bit of background about the Department of Ecology. It has oversight of the state's programs for air quality, climate pollution reduction, environmental assessment, hazardous waste and toxics reduction, nuclear waste cleanup, shoreland and environmental assistance, solid waste management, spill prevention and response, toxics cleanup, water quality and water resources. It also operates the Office of Equity and Environmental Justice, the Office of Chehalis Basin, and the Office of Columbia River. Are you glad I didn't ask you to recite all of those?
I was keeping my own notes as we went here.
That is quite a broad swath of responsibility. But let's start, because we haven't had an opportunity to sit down and talk before, about your background and what brought you to this particular job. Why did you want to be the Director of the Department of Ecology, especially coming off of your federal work? What was your discussion with Governor Ferguson as you were considering this?
Well, first, I'm really excited for the opportunity to be here today and not just introduce myself, but talk about some of the issues that we're working on at the Department of Ecology. I was really excited about the opportunity to come join the Ecology and the Ferguson administration at this moment in time, right, with such a sea change back in the other Washington, and really realizing that what we need to do is despite those headwinds that are coming out of D.C., is continue to move our work forward. Most people don't know, the Department of Ecology in Washington State was the first state-led agency in the nation charged with protecting public health and the environment. It actually predates the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So, coming on board in January after serving for a couple of years in the Biden administration, many things seem familiar. But at the same time, as someone who grew up in Washington State, being able to serve the state and continue to move our work forward was an opportunity too good to pass up.
I'm really interested because Governor Inslee was known as the climate governor. He put climate action as his sort of key priority and his signature issue. That's less true of Governor Ferguson. And so I'm interested, as you were coming into this position, the new governor is coming into his new role. And as you note, you're facing a very different climate in the other Washington. What was the conversation with the new governor about what his hope and expectations are for this agency?
Well, number one was to continue to move the work forward on the climate side, right? Last fall.
So not letting off the gas pedal on that.
Not letting off the gas pedal. And look, last fall, voters very clearly said we want to keep moving this work forward. More than 60% of voters supported keeping the Climate Commitment Act. There are not very many things statewide that pass by more than 60% vote, and so I thought that was a really strong indication of support by communities across the state to keep moving that work forward, and that was something that's a huge priority for Governor Ferguson. So is also thinking about all of the different ways that our agency intersects with communities across our state. And one of the things I often say is, our work literally touches every single person in the state, right? From water, air, other resources, the business community. And so, the governor, one of the governor's priorities is around good government, customer service. And, that's something that I bring into this job, having worked in various senior positions around the state these last several years. And, really making sure that we are customer-focused, community-focused in the work that we do. And, I think there's a way for us to do a couple things, and we've been proving it over and over again, that we can, whether it's fighting climate change or it's protecting our natural resources or restoring Puget Sound, we can do all of those things and still grow the economy at the same time. And I think so often those interests are pitted against each other. And Washington State has a long history of proving that no, our ethos of environmentalism also supports our economic development growth.
And we should talk more about that, because you're right. This is an agency, it's a legacy agency, but it is an agency that has historically had tensions with the business community. It's a regulatory agency, and you have plenty of critics of the Department of Ecology. So hopefully we can get back to that during our conversation this hour. Let me just also ask you, kind of based on that long list of responsibilities and areas of oversight, what are, and I know you've been traveling the state, listening, talking to folks, but what are three maybe key issues that are driving the conversation or taking up most of your time and energy right now? It's probably hard to whittle it down to that, but if you had to pick three, what would you say they are?
I would say from one is a very dramatic change in approach and the relationship that we have with the federal government. Most people don't know that the nation's environmental laws are primarily carried out by the states. And Ecology, on behalf of the state as an umbrella environmental organization, is charged with moving the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, as well as our state environmental laws. And we are funded to do that by the federal government. So, the first part of this year, really was trying to understand or anticipate rather, what was going to happen to our federal funding, the majority of which gets passed through our agency to the local level, and then also understanding, which of our authorities were going to be challenged by the new federal administration. So number one is just trying to wrap our hands around the chaos that was sort of defined the first several months of the new federal administration, and remembering that we'd kind of been through that before during the first iteration of the Trump administration. So getting through that, I think, number one, and sort of understanding where there are still opportunities to work with the federal government, where we need to stand up and work together with the Attorney General to protect our rights here in the state. The second, I would say, is as I've traveled the state, is just seeing the impacts of climate change. Everywhere we go, right? Every community I travel to is experiencing the impact of climate change. We just came off, one of the warmest and one of the driest summers we've had since 1895.
It's been pretty dramatic looking at Mount Rainier recently. There's hardly a skiff of snow on that mountain anymore.
Yeah, growing up in Seattle and looking out, west toward the Olympic Mountains, it always had snow, they always had snow on them, even through the summertime, and now that snow disappears so quickly in the springtime, and of course Mount Rainier as well. It's just a stark reminder of how rapidly the world around us is changing. So climate change would be number two. And number three would be I made a commitment to the governor when I started that I was going to be out and about, and I was going to be meeting with our communities and trying to find those places where we can partner to move our work forward. And I have to say, despite all of the noise right now, right, all of the distrust of government, all of the sort of disbelief that government can solve problems, is that people still want to sit and have a conversation, right? They still have hope that we can move the work forward, whatever that is. It's solving addressing a contaminated site in their community, or finally making progress at Hanford, or working to tackle climate change. And so, really trying to connect with people where they are and finding a way to solve problems. I've built my whole career on doing that, bringing people together to solve problems.
One more question just for setting the stage, and then we'll dive in. How does being a Native person, as you've referred to yourself, influence your thinking about the work that you do in this space?
Well, so as a Native person, again, I'm Cherokee, so my family is originally from the southeast part of the United States. My dad's family was on the last detachment of the Trail of Tears. And then, Cherokee Nation, we say we had two Trail of Tears. We had one in the 1830s during Indian removal, and then we had a second one in the 1950s during the recession and at that time. And so my dad grew up in Southern Oregon, then played football at the University of Washington, and we stayed here. And but despite all of those moves and the separation, I still am Cherokee and take great pride in staying connected to my heritage. And like most Native people, our connection to the natural world is hard to describe because it informs everything that we do, right? And our connection to water and the air and the four-legged critters and the winged ones, it all is how we measure how we are living our lives. For me now in this role, as I think about it, is we have a saying at Cherokee Nation. It's called "Gadugi," and what that says, what that means in the contemporary context is how we are working together for the benefit of the whole. And it's we use that over and over again of like, hey, we there are times when we may disagree, but we have to put that aside because we have this thing we have to deliver. And so for me, to be able to be in a position where I can bring my personal background and heritage into the conversation, where I can, be working with the tribes here in Washington State and understand the perspective that they are bringing, understand that the connection or the choices that they're being asked to make are choices they can't make sometimes, right? And so, I like to, I hope at least that will provide a perspective into the way that we make decisions and in the way that we seek out opportunities to move our work forward.
Okay, I think that's a nice setting of sort of the stage for the conversation that we're going to have. And I think the place to begin is this tension that you just referred to between the state's policies and the Trump administration's policies. Your most recent job was as FEMA Region 10 Administrator under the Biden administration. And as you mentioned, the states do a lot of the enforcement of these federal environmental laws. You were just at Climate Week, New York Climate Week. The president last week said that climate change is the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. His Environmental Protection Agency is changing its policies and reversing policies under the Biden administration. But take us in a little bit deeper. How is the land, the ground underneath your feet shifting here as the Trump administration comes in, asserts its kind of values and beliefs about these issues, and then Washington State, as a blue state that's trying very much to be a leader in environmental policy, is sort of running up against that? What does that start to look like?
Well, I'd say, first of all, at Climate Week, I was at New York Climate Week last week, meeting with folks from all over the United States and beyond the day that the president addressed the UN General Assembly. And, it was sort of a collective shrug of, okay, here we go again.
These two events were happening.
These two events were happening at the same time.
Yeah, and then the climate meeting.
But at the same time, I had the chance to spend time with folks like me from other states, be in rooms with other elected officials from not just the United States but beyond, and realizing that despite what the new administration's beliefs are on climate change and its impacts, is a sort of doubling down of we have no other choice but to continue to move the work forward, to decarbonize our economies, to unlock the opportunity that comes with that and building the economy of the future. I say all the time, you don't have to be a climate scientist to see with your own eyes how climate change is affecting our communities today. I also say, what's the choice, right? We could choose to spend the next 3.5 years at this point, sort of hiding and not wanting to be a target of these changes at the federal level, or we can continue to find ways to be innovative and to advance our state objectives here in the climate space. And to me, it's not really a choice, because the alternative is there is a cost to both, right? There is a cost to inaction, and that cost to inaction is, again, we're seeing whether it's in catastrophic wildfire or, more extreme weather and flooding, drought, et cetera. We have the tools at our disposal to actually begin to change that, right? And not only invest in the deployment of clean energy and clean vehicles, but also help communities confront the challenges that are being presented to them.
But how much harder does that job get done if the Trump administration, for instance, is under the EPA moving to undo the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding, or proposing that companies no longer have to report climate emissions?
So the administration has decided that, they're going to attack the science, right? They're going to undermine, decades worth of established science and understanding about the way in which fossil fuels are altering our environment. And what I continue to remind folks is, you can erase the science, but you can't erase what people are experiencing. And, we are challenging the Trump administration and the Trump EPA on these types of decisions that they're making. And it's been, I think, eye-opening to see the coalition of states, whether those are the governors or the AGs or others, who have come together to challenge the pullback of the endangerment finding as an example. But again, we in Washington State have a very strong foundation of state environmental and climate laws that we have been challenged multiple times, including during the previous Trump administration, and have continued to be found valid and in full force and effect. So as the EPA may make changes, we are going to continue to hold folks accountable here in the state and continue to move the work forward under, whether it's under the Climate Commitment Act or the Clean Fuel Standard or any of the other climate programs that the legislature has adopted over the last few years.
Before I move on to talk to you about the state's Cap and Invest program, is there anything else about the relationship right now with the federal government, or any other changes that are being made, or anything about just the two hats you've worn, both at EPA and now at the state, that come to mind before we shift to more of a state focus?
Look, I just think it's a really difficult time. It's a difficult time. I feel so, my heart just goes out to these federal employees who have become the target of this campaign by the Trump administration and former colleagues at EPA. And I was at EPA a couple months ago after the second wave of retirements, and just how many empty desks you see in these offices. And some folks might say, well, the government was bloated. And I'd say, these are civil servants who have dedicated their career to public service, that believe in the mission of protecting human health and the environment, and that we need as a partner on everything from approving grant applications to working with on updates to regulations and rules that we are responsible for implementing on behalf of the federal EPA. And so that relationship is very challenged right now. And at the same time, I continue to believe that as challenging as it is, we continue our level best to work with the federal government and hope that cooler heads prevail at some point, but also be willing to stand up and call it out when it's wrong. And it's wrong on the endangerment finding. It's wrong on the use of the Congressional Review Act and pulling back California's EV waivers. That puts people's lives at risk, right? It will result in greater pollution and greater public health impacts. And we have to stand up and do something about that.
Just briefly on that, there are supporters of the president and his policies who feel he is headed in the right direction, who do not want to see our oil and gas industry go away, jobs lost. Do feel that if not that the climate change statements are overstated, they feel that maybe it doesn't make economic sense for an individual state that's certainly not the most polluting state in the country, in fact, one of the least polluting, to take the lead on things that might drive up costs for the everyday consumer. So, the question is, what would you say to supporters of the president who are not as alarmed or not alarmed at all by some of these policies and feel that perhaps he's headed in the right direction on environmental policy?
Well, one of the things I've tried to do, again, is to get out across our communities, across our state, and have a conversation. Ask them what they are experiencing. Ask them what they think the solutions are. And whether I'm, meeting with farmers down in Whitman County who are worried about water access and increased severe storms, or a lack of water for our farmers in Western Washington. Growing up as a kid in Seattle, you never would imagine we'd have a water shortage in Western Washington, right? But we do. And so to me, it's getting away from the language of climate change and talking specifically about the everyday experience, the daily impact, whether it's your wallet, your business, or your opportunity for employment. And if we can cut through all of that and just remind ourselves that what we're talking about is how we continue to invest in our state and invest in our communities, I feel like there's an opportunity to come back together and try to solve together.
Okay, so the Cap and Invest program, as you know, the Climate Commitment Act was upheld at the ballot last year. You've talked about implementation 2.0 for this program. We have the auction system. We're working with other states and regions. There's the idea of sort of connecting these markets with California and Quebec. But where do things stand heading into 2026 with respect to this program?
So the Climate Commitment Act, we're 2 years into the CCA, right, and the marketplace you're referring to is our way of helping to decarbonize and incentivize the decarbonization of our state and the way that businesses operate. We're 2 years in, and those auctions have now raised $3.5 billion in revenues for our state, which are now being turned right around and investing in two things. Bucket one is in supporting that transition to a cleaner, greener economy and renewable energy, and two, in helping communities address the impacts of climate change. And what I'm talking about is, everything from, getting heat pumps out into communities that are the front lines of climate change, to supporting the conversion of, supporting the opportunity for folks to get into electric or low emission vehicle technology. Low emission vehicles. And so we're already seeing that, and we're only 2 years in. California has been at this game for many years, and I'm really very encouraged about the way in which that program is operating. We have all of our major emitters are part of our program, and again, it's generating significant revenues that we're now able to turn right around and invest in our own future. We are moving forward now with finding ways to link our markets with both California and Quebec, as you referenced. Now that California's Cap and Invest, they renamed it to the Cap and Invest program, like Washington. And we believe that is the natural next step as we have a greater market, provides more stability and more opportunities for businesses to invest in decarbonization.
What do you think the timeline is for merging those markets?
We started working through that process now. Our hope is later 2026. But there are pieces that we have to do versus California and Quebec, and if we can get all those stars to align, that's our goal is late 2026, or early 2027.
And can you speak to the changes that were under consideration in California that could have affected the ability to merge those markets? In the end, I guess where they landed is going to allow these markets to work together, but it sounds like things were kind of in question for a little bit there.
There were a number of questions and different policy proposals that were on the table in California, both from how long the program should continue to exist, should the program continue to exist, or should they move to a different form of climate policy. In the end, what they did was a straight extension.
Like a carbon tax even?
Yeah, they had different names for it, but looking at different ways.
So that would have been a completely different approach, which would have taken them out of contention, right?
Correct, that would have been a very different approach. But
So was that like a 3-alarm fire around Department of Ecology in this state when this was being considered down there?
Obviously we're having conversations internally and with our partners in California about that, and I know there were other folks.
Former Senator Reuben Carlisle was
Former Senator Reuben
He went down to
Carlisle,
Sacramento,
former Governor Inslee.
And he was the sponsor of the CCA, so he's still engaged.
Yeah, I think, what's important about where California landed is, folks who voted for that know that that part of that is also linking markets with Washington State, right? And so I think, again, having that sort of West Coast collaboration and realizing that, we are stronger together than we are apart makes a lot of sense as we continue our work.
There are criticisms. The Seattle Times editorial board, you were talking about the funding and how much has been raised through the carbon auctions. Seattle Times editorial page said under 14% or less than 14% of the carbon auction funds go to initiatives that actually reduce carbon emissions, and they say that's according to Ecology's own data. The $3 billion and counting raised through the auctions is not a trough for pet projects, they wrote. What's your response to that criticism?
Again, we're 2 years into this, and I think like any new program that's starting up, we're learning about what works and what should continue to be scaled. And I think some of the decisions that the legislature made in terms of where the resources were going in those early years, we're still evaluating and really trying to understand what the future brings. There have been criticisms that there's not enough actual greenhouse gas reduction happening as a result of
and that it's taking
auctions.
too long to see that because of the reporting periods.
Yeah, and look, the people that raise these criticisms, these are folks that oppose the Climate Commitment Act. They've opposed this at every step of the way. And so, what I continue to try to remind folks is that we're in the early stages of this. We're making investments. We're seeing businesses make investments to decarbonize, whether that's an oil refinery adding new technology or it's other companies that are investing in efforts to decarbonize. So when you look at, the folks who are the regulated community and the reports they're giving to us, we can see that the investment they're making, and we can see the reductions that they are achieving.
So you would say that carbon emissions are falling under this program?
Absolutely.
And can you say by how much?
It's super hard to quantify that, and a lot of attention has been paid to the inventory and what we are tracking. And the way I like to talk about it is, the inventory, we have a lot of data, but it's really complex. It's not just the CCA. The inventory captures all of our state's carbon reduction efforts. That's why it takes time. That's why there's a lag. And so to me, one of the best indicators, again, is what are the businesses reporting to us, which they're required to do on an annualized basis. We are working to make that data available more regularly. And it shows, again, that we're on a trajectory. At the same time, I would say, last year, 1 in 5 new vehicle sales in our state was for an EV or low carbon emitting vehicle. That's the equivalent of taking, just in 1 year, 1 million gas-powered cars off our street. Transportation accounts for 40% of greenhouse gases in the state. That is a huge impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the state of Washington.
Okay, let's take a quick break. We'll pick this up when we come back. When we return, we continue our interview with Department of Ecology Director Casey Sixkiller. Back after this.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Washington State is not missing high-speed police pursuits. Washington State is missing the possibility of a high-speed pursuit.
Driver fled.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Casey Sixkiller, Director of Washington's Department of Ecology. Just a couple more questions kind of on the criticism of this program. Again, you often hear from critics that the Cap and Invest program, the Climate Commitment Act, has driven up the cost of gas so that we're now the most expensive price per gallon in the country, and that it is taking a long time for this data to get reported, so much so that the Washington Policy Center is actually suing your agency, saying this is the lag time is too long, and they're actually saying that your agency violated the law in terms of. So if people are paying more, this program is supposed to be reducing our emissions. The frustration is we can't get the data in real time or even in like a year's time. And we don't really know how effective this is. You can see why people might be frustrated and might be suing and might be pretty mad when they go fill up at the gas tank. So I want to give you a chance to address that sort of, I realize this was upheld by voters by 6 and 10. On the other hand, there may be 4 and 10 who are pretty frustrated.
Sure. Well, look, a few things. Number one is, we are coming off a period here just recently where we had, very high gas prices across our state. And unfortunately, growing up here in Washington State, we've often had the highest gas prices in the state going back many, many years. And that's not an excuse, but I think it is point to something that's really important, and that is, how the gas companies set their pricing has always been a black box in the state. In fact, there have been several efforts in the legislature to try to open that up and provide more transparency. Obviously, there are federal and state gas taxes that are contributing to the price at the pump. But that fluctuation is real. We just had, the pipeline shut down just a few weeks ago. That created a spike in the price folks were paying at the pump. Those prices have started to come down again now. But, that's why our focus, though, right now under the CCA, right, is we know that EVs are a cheaper alternative. Right now, if you are an EV driver in this state, this is the 4th cheapest place to charge your car. Right, the equivalent is you're paying less than $1 per gallon. I'm old enough to remember when gas was 97 cents a gallon in Washington State. But when you think about that and taking people off of that roller coaster of gas prices, it has multiple benefits, right? It's money back in your pocket. It's got the public health benefits, and it's good for our economy. So, to me, the opportunity here is to try to use the resources that are being created by the CCA to help create alternatives for people so they can get out of these types of vehicles.
But you're not denying the idea that some of this gas price increase that we're seeing, or what we're paying at the pump, is a byproduct of the CCA. That's a piece of it. I mean, it seems like at one point the former governor, Inslee said it was going to be pennies or negligible, right. But even that was shown to not be the case, that there is a chunk of this which can be attributed to our policies.
Of course, there's a cost to regulatory compliance across the spectrum, whether that is in gas prices or any other number of things. And we're not denying that, okay. or the clean fuel standard. But at the same time, I would say that there's also a cost to the ongoing use of petroleum, and that's real.
Let me just hit on 2 other points here. One is the delay. So I understand, the Seattle Times was saying that it's taking too long, that the comprehensive emissions data takes years to compile. A completed emissions inventory of 2021 was released in January. The next sets of data won't come until late 2026. So there's that criticism that it's taking too long. And then there's the specific allegation in the Washington Policy Center lawsuit that says that your agency failed to release data as required and admitted as much in court. Now, I know you're new to the agency, and I believe that the lawsuit predates you, but can you address both of those, that A, it just takes too long generally, and B, there was actually a violation of the law here in terms of how information is being released?
Well, I can't speak to the latter because it does predate me, but on the general criticism of the data takes too long, again, I would say we're super early in implementing the suite of climate laws that we have in the state. It is not made any easier by the U.S. EPA pulling offline the greenhouse gas inventory itself and removing a tool that businesses across the country had become accustomed to in submitting their data, which we pull, and other states who have similar programs have been pulling. So, I fully acknowledge that there's frustration with the lag of time that goes that occurs between the time that data is coming in and we're crunching those numbers and releasing them back out. At the same time, I would say it's incredibly complex, right? We are trying to take all of these data points from tailpipe emissions of individual vehicles to large carbon emitters, industrial carbon emitters, and calculating that data in such a way that can really show us the progress that we are making, and we want to get it right. So, again, we are working to both create our own inventory. We are using resources that the legislature provided to us. We're building that out now. We're working with other states, California being one of them, on how best to do that, so we can increase the amount of frequency. But I would say our data comes out more quickly than it does in California. So, it is a criticism. At the same time, I think it's acknowledgement of just how complicated it is.
The last criticism that I want to mention to you, again, is from Washington Policy Center. and Todd Myers, who has said that the projects funded by the CCA, he says, have been wasteful. Many of them produce no climate benefit at all, and those that do squander resources, spending 141 times as much to reduce a metric ton of CO2 as projects available in the private sector. So again, the argument is the private market could be doing this much more effectively, much more cheaply than what the state has set up. I'd like you to address that criticism.
Well, I think that's an easy criticism. However, the facts behind it, I think, are kind of hollow, right? We specifically set up in this state a market-based approach to reducing carbon emissions, and it's working. And the suggestion that somehow the business community, short of that, would have access to capital, would have reliable understanding of the targets that they need to meet, and would make those investments. I would love to see some examples of where in other parts of the country that's occurring. What I see when I go around the state is because of the CCA, businesses are making investments in a way to decarbonize. I visited a business in Spokane recently who CCA passed, and they went and made a multi-million-dollar investment in their exhaust system, so they weren't subject to the CCA, right? That's a benefit to the community, to that business, and but it was driven by, them making a choice about whether or not they wanted to be, subject to CCA regulations or not, but that also helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So we do have in statute targets for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. As I understand it, we haven't been on target to meet those targets. What is your understanding under the CCA of how close we're going to get to reaching those targets, how much of a miss we're going to be? How does that line up?
Well, I think that, first of all, we have three sets of targets, right? It's over 30 years. And, obviously 2030 is a very important year for us.
It's coming right up.
It's coming up, is right around the corner, as hard as that is.
And remind us of what that target is for 2030. Do you remember it off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I can't, there are too many numbers in my head.
But we're trying to get below historic, essentially, norms. Below I can't remember if it's 1990 levels or 2000, but it's supposed to be going
right now.
down.
We are 14% under where we were in the mid 2000s, and so and that predates, that includes part of the CCA, but it's not the entire timeline of just the last couple of years.
So very specifically to the 2030 targets, are we going to get there?
I think, I feel very confident that so long as we continue to move forward and make investments, and our market continues to perform as it was designed to do, that we'll hit those targets. It is, but again, we're learning, right? And we are adjusting. I think that's a really important. When I talk about implementation 2.0, it is also a reflection of, the legislature and the governor at the time made a lot of assumptions about how this was going to work. And we are now learning in real time what it looks like in Washington State. And so, we are obviously evaluating that. We're having the conversations with covered entities and the communities that are impacted by climate change to make sure that we are meeting all aspects of the law itself. Again, investing back into that transition and investing in reducing the impacts on individual communities. And I really do believe we're going to get there. Again, when I think about EVs, that's a great indicator.
Well, let's make that transition to EVs. You've mentioned it several times. We know the federal rebates expired this week. That was $7,500. It was an incentive for people to buy. The governor has announced the Evergreen, or what are we calling
Evergreen?
it? Evergreen program, which I understand is sort of trying to figure out how the state might be able to supplement or supplant that with no specific proposal yet. And obviously there's, the legislature is facing a budget crisis. But what is the early thinking, if the federal subsidies are not going to be in existence anymore, what the state might be able to do to continue to incentivize people to buy EVs?
Well, I think that's one of the main drivers of this Evergreen initiative is to have an intentional conversation, with folks across the state, individuals, communities, industry, to try to understand, despite what's happened at the federal level, how do we continue to move this forward? We see just by vehicle sales, there is an appetite for this technology, and we are learning more about the cost effectiveness of these types of making the transition to these types of vehicles.
And the state has a policy of transitioning to them in the not too distant future. So if the sales start to slack off, that's going to further affect the state's ability to meet those targets.
Again, 40% of our emissions in the state come from the transportation sector. So continuing to decarbonize that across the spectrum of vehicles is a really important policy objective.
So so the conversation will be convened, but if there's not money available to subsidize or to create not obvious money available to create some sort of state subsidy, is that the thinking, that there might be a pitch to the legislature to fund something, at least for lower income buyers or something, or is there some other alternative that's being thought of?
I think I want to try not to prejudge what people decide and the feedback that we get as part of these conversations. But I would say, over the last 2 years, the Department of Commerce, using CCA resources, had a very successful program of targeting resources to lower income and frontline communities around EV leasing, and it was super successful. At the same time, right now, we are working to continue to increase our EV charging network. We were amongst the states that challenged the Trump administration, who froze that funding, and we helped get it $55 million unlocked. Working across the states of Oregon and California, we're now committed to EV charging, in every major transportation corridor along the West Coast. At the same time, later this year, the Washington State Department of Transportation, is going to launch its $130 million program specifically around heavy-duty trucks, and trying to find ways to decarbonize that sector of the transportation sector, over the next few years.
I do know that there was under the IIJA, the Federal Infrastructure Law, money went to states to build these EV charging stations. Other states like Ohio, New York have kind of leapt ahead. I think Pennsylvania, Kentucky's got its first NEVI station. Washington has lagged. We're supposed to be this green leader. I think Ohio has up to 17 of them, and they've got 17 more in the pipeline. Again, I know you're new to the position, but do you have an understanding of why we've been slow to either draw down and or spend that money and get these gas stations of the future, which are actually EV charging stations of the future, in place? Why would a state like Ohio be leading Washington on this?
Well, I can't speak for what occurred before I came into this role. What I can say is, whether it's the NEVI station or any of these programs and investments, is coming into it again with a solutions-oriented approach to how I do my job, and really thinking about, okay, is there red tape? What is the problem? What's the barrier? And let's not let ourselves be the barrier to moving the work forward. I like to say, let's not the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so getting those resources drawn down and getting the investments made is a huge priority, not just for me, but for my counterparts in the administration.
And I think that that's a great transition, just more broadly, when the state is trying to move to a clean energy future and phase out fossil fuel-based energy sources. And we see, there's this whole sort of abundance theory that we're hearing about a lot from some on the progressive left, that Democrats will pass these laws to build more houses or to move to green energy, and then there will be all of these sort of bureaucratic hurdles to doing that. If you're trying to build a bunch more clean energy, whether that's wind or solar or nuclear or anything else, to try to make that phase out happen, what are some thoughts you have as the new ecology director about how to speed the pipeline while also respecting, for instance, tribal communities who've pushed back on some of these proposals?
Well, I will say, Governor Ferguson is a huge priority, is we know we need to continue to invest in energy production.
I want to say, if I'm remembering correctly, 2030 is the year we're supposed to be phasing off of all new cars are supposed to be non-polluting. Maybe it's 2035. And
well, that's all subject to that California waiver that went away.
Okay. So that could be.
That's.
But that was the goal, and then I think 2045 for clean energy. So the clock is ticking. These deadlines are coming up. So just that context, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And you had Director Joe Wynn from the Department of Commerce on the program not that long ago. I think earlier this spring, and whether it's FSEC, Department of Commerce, the Utility and Transportation Commission Chair, we have been working together to try to figure out, okay, what are the barriers to moving this work forward, to getting projects cited and up and running. And I have to say, I think that focus from us as leaders, frankly, the demand from the governor that we work across our silos to deliver results has been very helpful, and is helping to unlock ideas. So one area in particular, HR 1, President Trump's big beautiful bill, right? It, in addition to going after the EV tax credits, it also terminated the tax credits for solar and wind energy development. So that has a longer timeline than the EV ones do. So we've pulled together a team, and we're looking at what are those projects that are on the books right now that have started either environmental review and or permitting that we can help to facilitate getting online to still access those tax credits before they expire. The benefit of that is not only are we working together to move those projects forward, we also are learning a lot about our environmental review and permitting processes. And I think being able to look at that in real time, and whether it's working obviously on the executive branch side of the administration, or working with the legislature and other stakeholders and the tribes, it's like, what is the Venn diagram here, right? We know we need more energy. We know we want it to be renewable. We don't want to be building new fossil fuel plants. How can we do that more effectively, but also not do it in a way that forces tribes to make very difficult decisions about impacts to their resources?
Is there a particular choke point to this that you've identified yet?
I think it's amazing how many conversations I'm in around the state of how much people, including myself, don't know about how all these processes work, right? SEPA is an example, right? This is our state version of NEPA, our environmental review program. Most people don't know that most SEPA work is done at the local level. And so they often look at Ecology and go, you guys are taking forever on SEPA. We're like, this isn't even isn't even on our desk. This is being done at the local level. But one of the ways that we've been working to address that and create more predictability and try to reduce the amount of time it takes to get through that is, earlier this summer, we issued 3 what we call programmatic EISs, or environmental review documents, for utility-grade solar, onshore wind, and hydrogen. And the purpose of that was, that was built on engaging with stakeholders, with developers, and saying, okay, what are the challenges you hit when you're going through the SEPA process, and what do you need? And what they want is predictability. They want consistency. And so, working with those project sponsors early, giving them the template of what they need to do. On the one hand, I guess I assumed that already existed, but it turned out it didn't. And so now we are in the process of making sure that folks who want to develop a project in Washington State are aware of that. But we're talking about taking months off of the timeline, just in SEPA. And if you can shrink the timeline up front, but still preserve the integrity of the analysis that SEPA was required to do, well, all of a sudden you're able to deliver projects more quickly and less costly.
Let's just hit, in the few minutes we have left, a few more issues. I want you to go back to the clean vehicle standards and explain where things stand. As I understand it, there was a pause in June based on, is it the Trump administration's pulling back on the advanced clean cars rule?
Correct. Yeah. So under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Act has preserved for years the ability of states to go above what federal standards, what the federal government has set in terms of air quality standards, or tailpipe emissions in this instance. California has had a waiver on the books for years. Washington State, amongst other states, were able to also be part of that waiver. And earlier this year, the Trump administration not only challenged that, but then the Congress of the United States voted to overturn and remove that waiver. So, running in parallel in Washington State, we had adopted many of the same standards that California had, phasing out of sales of gas-powered cars, and a number of other regulations and rules and incentives around, continuing to build out the infrastructure and the conversion of heavy-duty trucks. After Congress passed that law, we put that work on pause. realizing that we were going to challenge that decision by Congress in court. So part of Severgreen is saying, okay, while that is playing out in the courts, let's continue to have a conversation about how we move the work forward, because we know there's demand, and we know it is critical to meeting our 2030 emissions.
And what is the implication or the impact of the June 25 pause? Like, where does that leave this goal of moving to all new vehicles being sold in the state are non-polluting?
I think it's too early to tell. I think it's like anything in life, right? The steeper the climb, the harder it is, right? And so again, going from serving in the Biden administration, where it was a priority, under the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill to invest in this infrastructure and help support states and local communities in making that transition. This abrupt change by the new administration and the Congress obviously is, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, is very challenging. But again, what we see from consumers is a demand to continue to expand access to these things. And, I have confidence that we're going to continue to find what creative solutions are available to us, think about how we are spending our resources and supporting those ideas to keep the work moving forward.
We are starting to get a little bit of rain this week on the west side, but as you noted, it's been a very hot, dry summer with much of the state in drought conditions. You don't control Mother Nature, but as you're sitting in this position and looking at these trend lines, what is it? What are you thinking? What conversations is it prompting with your staff?
Every single community I visited across our state, easily in the top three and often the top is water. Access to water, water security. You need water for housing, you need water for development, you need water to grow the breadbasket of the country over in eastern Washington and increasingly on the west side. And the truth of the matter is, with climate change, we're still getting a lot of water, but we're not getting it when we need it.
Yeah, and it's not getting stored in the
and it's not getting stored.
Snowpack.
And so, for us, it's having a more focused conversation about what water looks like. And I'll be honest with you, I am driven by what folks are experiencing in the Southwest United States. Like, we do not want that to happen here in the state of Washington. But if we're not convening conversations and working with the legislature and others around water access, that could very well be our future.
You've had a role with Hanford Cleanup, both at the federal level and now at the state level. Can you just speak very briefly to sort of the status out there in terms of the cleanup, which everybody knows has taken a long time and is costing a lot more than was originally hoped?
Hanford's been in the news a lot the last few weeks, and I wish it was for all of the right reasons. Unfortunately, it's been because of some ups and downs with the Trump administration and Department of Energy. But I do think we're on the right path again. The Hanford cleanup is super complex. There's different components to it. One is dealing with the 9 reactors and all of the material that they've created and decommissioning. Dealing with groundwater, many millions of gallons of groundwater that still has been treated and still needs to be treated, and specifically dealing with the tank waste. Buried in the ground at Hanford is 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste that was, a reflection of 40-plus years of plutonium development.
And some of it in leaking tanks.
60-plus tanks have already leaked. Some of these tanks are, the thing is those tanks were not designed to still be being used today. So the exciting thing is we are now at this critical opportunity where we, for the first time, and since the first waste was created 80 years ago, to be able to start treating that waste and storing it safely.
That's the vitrification process.
That's the vitrification process of actually of turning that waste into glass, encasing it in glass. And I am excited that we are in the final stages of providing all of the permits and licenses to the Department of Energy so that they can meet their October 15th milestone deadline to begin doing that work.
Okay. A final comment is we have just a few seconds left. If we talk in a year, what do you want to be able to report back generally and broadly, not on a specific issue, but given the trying times you're in and the tensions right now with the administration, what's the bottom line, just very briefly?
The bottom line is that we're still making progress, right? And that we are working to respond to the concerns that folks are bringing to us, whether it's in the regulated community or individuals across our state, and that that we're not distracted by the noise coming out of the other Washington.
I'm going to stop you there. Casey Sixkiller, the Director of Department of Ecology. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much
Appreciate it
for
very
having
much.
me.
Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.